uh, Julian Thompson. I'm sure he needs no real introduction. Going to give us a talk tonight about Pensychnant, based around the book, which you can see that on the screen now. Many people will have probably been to Pensychnant, I'm sure, and will know Julian as the warden there, who's been there more than 30 years, so he knows the place inside out and back to front, knows probably every brick and every stone that's been touched there, knows all the trees and most of the ground of the plants, and knows it like the back of his hand, I'm sure. And now I think probably knows all the sheep by name and by sight, having kind of worked there worked on the farm for the last 5 or so years, having not done so before. So really looking forward to his talk tonight. So over to you, Julian, if that's okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And this is the book, An English Pastoral by James Rebanks. I do know that many of you have already read the book. In fact, some of you recommended it to me. It was published in 2020 and became very highly acclaimed amongst naturalists in the sort of lockdown years. I'm not a great reader, but I did find it a very compelling read. If you haven't read it, it is highly recommended. Yeah, when I read it again with the thought of doing this talk, I was a bit dismayed to find it was quite lacking in any actual facts that I could purloin and steal from it. It isn't a book about facts and statistics. It's very much about the heartfelt feelings of a humble farmer in the Lake District. It's about a changing way of life, about a changing countryside. It is about loss, loss of a way of life, loss of a community, loss of heritage and culture, and loss of wildlife and landscape that went with that. In many ways, it tells a story which we all know already. We all know that 98% of our wildflower meadows have been destroyed since the war. That's the statistics which we get banded around. But it tells this story very passionately and personally, and from a farmer's perspective. And the book is set in English Lake District. Yeah, it's very much a story which we would recognise here in Wales. So Pensychnant's farm depends on the employment of a fairly old school Welsh shepherd from Pentravoelas. And he farms the way he does because his father's father farmed that way. This is very much his story. It is also the story of Pensychnant Farm itself. Pensychnant now has about 60 breeding ewes. To put that in perspective, most modern farms would have 600, 1,000 sheep would be quite normal. Until the 1970s or 80s, Pensychnant would have been an enviable, wealthy farm. Now it is simply too small. And this is James Rebank. I don't know him. This is a photo from the internet. So this is his story, and you'll see he's not an old man. He grew up in the 1970s, so he's younger than me, and I don't consider myself that old. But to make the point that this isn't ancient history. This is all within living memory. This is all within touching distance. So it's a very rapid change. James Rebank spent a lot of his childhood helping on his grandfather's farm. By the 1960s and 70s, tractors had already taken over from horses. His grandfather did have a small, outdated Massey Ferguson, rather as we have here at Pensychnant. But his grandfather had worked with horses. He loved horses, and he believed that a farmer's boots should be in contact with the soil. So even though tractors had made the work easier, in many ways, he farmed in exactly the same way, with the same implements and sort of the same mindset as he had all those years before. It was a rotational mixed farm. So we had sheep, cattle, and arable, mostly fodder crops probably. It was a self-sufficient farm. They were poor, but there was also great pride in their stock and in their whole way of life. And Pensychnant was exactly the same. Every farm would tell the same story. Pensychnant was a rotational mixed farm. Here it's in 1937. It had sheep, cattle, dairy cattle, chickens, pigs, crops, which again were probably mainly fodder crops. If you looked on this view today, you'd find it more or less the same. There are more trees now. But if you look at the home field, we can't see the species there, but you can see that it is clearly much more rough and diverse pasture than it is today. And I'll take you back to 1840. If I can put this on. Pensychnant is here in the middle. Yeah, this is the tithe map of 1840. In 1840s, all of the parishes of England and Wales were mapped to convert their tithes to monetary values for the church. So Pensychnant's in the middle. The pastures at the top of the second pasture here were called Gorse, Gorse Canol, and Gorse Petla, which is a curious mixture of English and Welsh. Gorse, the middle Gorse, and the far Gorse, indicating that at this time it was quite rough land. We wouldn't think of it really as good farmland today, but the gorse itself was a valuable crop. They would have cut the gorse and put it through a furze mill to grind it for winter feed for the cattle. And the ruin here, which we now called Mearthin, was called Mearthin Potash. And the family that lived here in 1840 made their livelihood by collecting bracken from the mountainside and burning it to make potash for the soap industry at Port Sunlight. So clearly a very hard way of life. We know that there were areas of woodland on the estate, just as there are now, but all of it was described as pasture because that is what it was used for. And we know that in 1840, about a third of the farm was arable. In the 1930s, we know that one of the fields was called the cornfield. Probably wasn't corn, it was probably oats and barley. One of the fields down here near the lake was called cabbage, the cabbage field. So clearly at that time, much more diverse. We know up till probably the 1950s or 60s, there were sheep, cattle, dairy cattle, chickens, pigs, and as I said, the crops. So they had a few of everything. Today it is just sheep. If you looked at the map, that map by the Ordnance Survey today, it would look substantially the same. But actually, if you were to look at the land and the whole way of life, it was really quite different. Right. It's tempting, but probably wrong, to look back on this era as the golden age for farmland wildlife. But the truth is that some people thrived, some species thrived, and some didn't. So the polecat had been persecuted almost to extinction by the year 1900. Other species did proffer. The arable fields created habitats for the annuals such as the poppies and cornflowers. Hay meadows created habitat for more perennial plants such as the knapweeds and hawkweeds and orchids. Winter stubbles which we don't have nowadays, fed the linnets and finches. Interesting to know, I have never seen a sparrow at Pensychnant in all the years I've been there, because on a modern sheep farm there is no spilled seed, so there's nothing for the sparrows. And the soils would have had a healthy microbial and fungal and invertebrate fauna. This was more the era when the seagulls followed the plough. But important to note that there is absolutely nothing natural about the farmland flora and fauna. It was created by and depends on man's activities. So if farming created the landscapes and wildlife that we enjoy today, but it created it very much by accident. No farming has ever been done solely for wildlife, with the exception perhaps of a few privileged examples on modern day nature reserves. Farming and conservation have never really gone hand in hand. Farming was very much a struggle against nature. James Rebanks described how he shot the crows. He wasn't sentimental about wildlife. And probably farming is inherently bad for most species of wildlife. The farmer is doing his best to impose his will over nature. The wildlife which survives despite the best efforts of the farmer. The farmer has always been trying to improve his land. So even our best flower-rich meadows, the best chalk grasslands, they were never managed for the flowers. The flora which we value so highly is the species which survive despite our efforts, not because of them. It is probably in the 1950s that things really began to go wrong for wildlife. This was the dawn of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Di, the old farmer at Pensychnant, came with what they called the War Rag, which was the Ministry of Agriculture. It was a very progressive time after the war. Pensychnant was a perfect model farm. It had a tractor. They concreted the yard. They had piped water in the milking sheds, loading ramps, and they had the sheep dip. Di, the old farmer, said you couldn't see the chimney of his caterpillar tractor because the gorse was so high. So really, in the words of my old geography school textbooks, the land was put to good use, and that was the way they thought of it then. The environment wasn't really considered. The organochlorines in the sheep dip were either left in the bath for the next year, where they leached into the soil, or they were emptied down the stream. I don't even think this was illegal, and it was certainly normal. Every farm would just tip the sheep dip down the stream. Maybe in about the 1970s, Pensychnant had a flock of about 326 ewes, which you can compare to the present flock of about 60. And this dense stocking rate was encouraged by the European Common Agricultural Policy, which paid headage. So the more livestock a farmer had, the more subsidy they had. And the overgrazing which it caused could only be supported by copious imports of cheap inorganic NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizers. I don't mean to condemn the farmers of this era, and I knew Di quite well. Di was proud of his achievements, and quite rightly so. But this was the whole governmental thrust of post-war agriculture. I reckon that Di, the old farmer, who farmed Pensychnant from the war to when he died, which I think was 2005, I think that Di did more to change the landscape and its biodiversity than anybody else in history. If you think about that for a moment, there have been absolutely massive changes in the landscape of the area since the Stone Age woodlands were first felled, but it all happened slowly over hundreds of years or even thousands of years. But now we have the capacity to make massive changes within one generation. And now, with fertilizers and pesticides, farmers can achieve what every farmer since time immemorial has been aiming for: nice fat sheep on perfect green pastures. So this is a perennial ryegrass pasture. It has been sown rather like an arable crop, fertilized with inorganic fertilizers, maintained with selective herbicides, and it will probably be ploughed up and reseeded after 3 or 5 years, started again. It's a monoculture which supports virtually no wildlife. When the Women's Institute sing Jerusalem of England's green and pleasant land, or when we drive along and look out of our car windows, then it is all very green and beautiful. Remember that most of the countryside is actually devoid of wildlife. And even though there's been no fertilizer at Pensychnant for more than 30 years, Pensychnant's fields were not very dissimilar to this. I can remember a few years ago leaning on the gate with the farmer and looking at the field, and he said, "Oh, it's a good field, that is." And it was in the first flash of growth after the hay was cut, and it looked like a lawn. It was even more like a lawn than our lawn is. And I was utterly dismayed because there wasn't a flower in it. Yeah, you could walk across Pensychnant's Kaimaur, the big field, and you wouldn't find a buttercup. It was immaculate. Jane Rebank's father rented a farm and was more progressive than his grandfather, as was typical of the 1970s. They used lots of fertilizers and pesticides, and they admired or even envied the big prosperous farms with the big tractors and the big stock sheds, and they tried to emulate the big farms in the belief that they had to try and keep up. James went then to work on Australian farms, which some of the Australian farms were as big as English counties, and he concluded that British farming just couldn't compete. The small fields, the small sheds, the small farms, they would just have to be completely swept aside if modern agriculture was to feed the world and be profitable. And then James Rebank visited Kentucky in the plains of America, where he expected to see the absolute pinnacle of big-scale, modern, productive farming. But instead, he saw a collapsed economy, lots of deserted farms, lots of derelict land. And then he came home, back home, some of the farms with big production units that they had once envied had gone bankrupt. And his own family farm, in trying to keep up with everybody else, had chased grants and bank loans. They were still poor, they were still struggling, overworked and stressed, and in hopeless debt. The only winner of this situation was the bank manager. In the 1980s, I lived in a caravan in the fens of East Anglia. This is a view from my caravan window. This is some of the most productive arable land in Britain. There was one field which was 1 kilometre square. It exactly filled 1 kilometre square on the Ordnance Survey. And it had nothing in it except winter wheat. If you walked across that field, and it would take you 15-20 minutes to walk from side to side of the field, you wouldn't find one weed. It was perfect. It was incredible. But also the flip side of this is that in the fens of East Anglia, I have seen the peaty soil blowing away in the winter wind. The farmer would be cross because his newly planted sugar beet seed was being blown away with it. And in parts of the fenlands, the rich peaty soil is blowing away or oxidizing and degrading till it exposes the heavy marine and rather infertile soil which underlays the whole region. Near the caravan, in the fens, was Home Fen. Home Fen was the site of Whittlesea Mere, which until early Victorian times was the largest inland lake in the whole of England. So bigger than anything in the Lake District. And the Victorians drained it, as we say, to put the land to good use. I think they knew that the soil, the peaty soil, would shrink. So they buried an iron post, which came from the Crystal Palace in London. They buried the iron post into the peat and bedded it down into the heavy marine clay underneath. And it was buried till the top of that post was exactly flush with the soil. By 1870, 20 years later, the post repeated shrunk till the post stood as tall as from that man's finger to the top. Now, another 150 years later, that post is 13 feet tall. We are literally destroying the soil upon which we depend. I was talking about yellowhammers the other day, and somebody had seen one. It was quite a red letter day to see a yellowhammer. It's now 25 years or so since I've seen a yellowhammer at Pensychnant. Whereas, you know, when I was young, they were one of the very common birds in the farmland hedgerows. Farmland birds are declining faster than any other group of British birds. You can see all British birds shown here in black are showing a slight downwards trend, but the farmland birds shown in red really have a crashing downward trend, which is due really to the use of herbicides and pesticides, the increasing loss of diversity, changes in crops. I think especially the change to winter wheat and the loss of winter stubbles. But as I said, this is a man-made environment, and our wildlife has always changed with time, and there will always be some winners and losers. So we know now that buzzards, which were once persecuted and quite rare, are now really quite common everywhere. I can remember seeing the first, what we thought was the first Anglesey buzzard many years ago. Now buzzards are so common that a bird watcher wouldn't scarcely lift his eyes to see one. Conversely, starlings and sparrows, which were once everywhere, are now declining. So there are winners and losers. In the last 40 years, 2/3 of our moth species have declined and 3/4 of our butterflies. That leaves us with the fact that some of the moth species and some of the butterflies have increased. More have declined than increased, so we're getting a loss of diversity. But the more worrying factor, I think, is that the sheer number of moths has declined by 1/3. It is not just that now wildlife communities have changed, some species becoming commoner and others declined. Now the sheer amount of wildlife has declined. There's just less of it. And you can see this when you drive along. You don't get insects splattered on your windscreen. The recent State of Nature report concluded that Britain is one of the most nature depleted countries in the whole world, which was a fairly damning accolade. But I'm guessing everybody that's here thinks that the loss of biodiversity does matter, but on more human level, we are destroying our environment. Llanrwst now floods because the boglands of the Mignite, which once acted like a big sphagnum sponge, have been deep drained. So the rain which falls in the mountains and once would have been held back by this sponge of sphagnum is now on its way to Llanrwst within a few hours and flooding the town. And the farming soils are now largely inorganic, with very little microbial or fungal activity and very few soil invertebrates. Without these, the nutrient cycles are broken. The soil is now acting more or less like a plastic sponge. And just like a bar sponge, if you applied enough fertilizer, you could probably grow crops on it. But once you stop applying the very expensive fertilizers, the sponge would be very soon depleted. James Rebanks explains how the traditional mixed rotational farm recycled the nutrients from the manure and avoided depleting the nutrients by rotating the crops. Maybe these old-fashioned ways couldn't achieve the mega yields which we achieve today and which we think are necessary to feed the world. But when you pause to think, the modern methods are not sustainable. We can't continue to feed the world by modern methods. And it's not all about us and about humans. It's my belief that we have a moral obligation to conserve biodiversity. I can't really explain this in scientific or economic or practical terms. It is just my belief. Our farmland ecology won't be noticeably affected by the extinction of the corncrake in North Wales. A generation ago, the corncrakes were common on Anglesey and people complained that they kept them awake at night, and now there are none. And most of the ecology will carry on with little effect, but without them, I just feel that the world is impoverished. And this is the story of many of our species. James Rebanks now farms what had once been his grandfather's farm. I think James Rebanks has come to love nature, but he hasn't done it for nature alone. He saw how industrial agriculture had destroyed the natural beauty of his homeland. It had destroyed families and communities, and how it was unsustainable. And now at Pensychnant, the charity has taken over management of the farm. This spring, will be our 7th season of lambing. We started off 7 years ago with 50 breeding ewes and a tractor which only steered left. We've now got 61 ewes and breeding our own flock. It's going well, touch wood. I'm having fun whizzing around on my quad bike. I don't really know what we're doing. And I know that we couldn't do this without the expertise and wisdom of our shepherd, Noah Evans. But now at last we have the opportunity and the will to farm with wildlife in mind. You notice that I don't promise to be farming for wildlife, only farming with wildlife in mind. It is a compromise. Pensychnant has to be a commercially viable farm. But that's part of the point, is to prove that farming and conservation can go hand in hand, I think, as they must. As a conservationist, I think I grew up very much blaming farmers for all our environmental problems. But now that I'm involved in farming, it does change the way you think about farming. And it has to be a compromise. It is exciting. I think it is the most significant development at Pensychnant since the charity began 30 odd years ago. And it's just sheep. It would be better if we could go back, roll the clock back and have a bit more diversity. Cows would be good. But at the moment, it is just sheep. To graze the Freeth and the mountain, we need a hardy breed. So these are Welsh mountain sheep. I had thought it would be a nice idea to have a rare breed. If we had black sheep or badger-faced sheep, I'd know which ones were mine when they were lost on the mountain, because all the sheep look the same to me. However, we did settle on the Welsh mountain sheep, which, although not rare, that is the traditional breed in the North Wales uplands. And it's a good choice. The Welsh mountain is a hardy sheep. They lamb outside, they'll graze the mountain. They're excellent mothers. So quite a low maintenance breed. And all of the farmland is just grass. It's not, I'm not pretending it's special. Yeah, like most of Wales, it was reseeded after the war and had every fertilizer going up through the 1970s and 80s. And crucially, there have been no fertilizers or herbicides for more than 30 years. 2 of our fields are deliberately overgrazed for choughs. Conservationists love to complain that Wales is overgrazed by sheep, and certainly some of it is, but choughs are one species which benefits from short grazed turf. There are 11 pairs of chough, which is 5% of the Welsh population in the Carneddau, and especially around Penma and Pensychnant, with 2 pairs on Conwy Mountain. On one occasion, we had 80 choughs in our farmyard, which was quite special. And apart from the chough fields, which kept a short grass, most of the fields we try to keep at a medium length, say 3-4 inches in the growing season, which is better for some of the wildflowers. They're not good for wildflowers. I'm not asking much, just a few buttercups would please me. But most farms nowadays don't even support buttercups. In the year 2000, we walked the length of the River Conwy, 40 miles from the Midnight Moors down to the sea at Morfa Conwy. And during that 40 miles, we went through only one field, which you would describe as a field of buttercups. So even something as humble as buttercups are not so common nowadays. Pensychnant's fields are underlain by boulder clay, mesotrophic and neutral in pH. So naturally they'd support buttercups, black knapweed, birdsfoot trefoil, plantains and hawkweeds. These are just totally normal everyday fields. However, the Lowland Grassland Survey of Wales says that no habitat has suffered more from agricultural intensification than unimproved mesotrophic grassland. 90% of our lowland grassland in Wales has been improved and is dominated now by perennial ryegrass. Of the remaining 10%, less than 5% is regarded as unimproved. Pensychnant's fields will not be classed as unimproved. I just hope that they're at the better end of semi-improved. Managing grassland for flowers with sheep isn't really the best idea. Cattle would be better, or a mixture would be better. Sheep are selective grazers with a positively spiteful preference for eating flowers. If you put sheep in a field of long grass, they will eat the flowers first. One day maybe one day we'll have some Highland cattle or belted Galloway cattle. One of the projects of which I'm most pleased at Pensychnant has been the restoration of Pensychnant's marsh. This area had been fenced by Brian Stott 40, 50 years ago because the cows ate the orchids. This was well intentioned, but unfortunately entirely the wrong thing to do. The result was that the grass went rank. Eventually it was overtopped with brambles, and eventually they were overtopped by 20-foot tall willows. So the orchids, most of the wildflowers disappeared. It was just black earth, black mud beneath them. So over many years with volunteers, we cut down all the willows and brambles and instigated a program of cutting, and it's been very successful. Here we have great carpets of ragged robin in June, and quite a diversity of insects. All of the work on the marsh was done by hand by volunteers. Friends of the Earth wanted to be totally environmentally friendly and cut it all with a scythe, but when they weren't looking, I used a brush cutter. But it still all needs raking up to avoid the build-up of thatch and build-up of nutrients. And this level of human endeavour just isn't sustainable. Over the years, we all got old and creaky, and enthusiasm waned. But this, unfortunately, is the way we've managed most of our nature reserves throughout Britain over the years, and it just isn't sustainable. These habitats were created by farming. They need to be maintained by farming. And now we've got this field into a state that I can graze it at the end of the summer. Cattle would be better, but because sheep don't like getting their feet wet. But yes, I can graze it with the sheep and maintain some of the diversity. In 2021, we dug 7 ponds on areas of wet land which were just too wet and rushy to be of much agricultural use. This is one of the biggest, but they're all really quite shallow. This one's now quite well vegetated over. Within 1 hour of the JCB driving away from this pond, there was a broad-bodied chaser setting up territory. Maybe it's not surprising that a broad-bodied chaser came. We know that we have those, and dragonflies can fly. But more surprising perhaps was that in the first week, there were thousands of the flatworm Polycelus nigra. So they can't fly, so I don't know quite where they all came from. They must have been in the wet grass already. Meadows seem to have captured everybody's interest in recent years. So Pensychnant's got 3 meadows covering 12 acres. Meadows are more of a way of managing land than simply a habitat. They are, crucially, the fields are grazed in the winter time. Then in about April or beginning of May, they will be shut up to grow the hay. Traditionally, the hay might be cut in June when the grass is at its lushest and the sun is at its warmest. But I try to cut in July or the beginning of August because it gives more species chance to set seed if they are cut later. Again, just like everything, it's only beneficial to some species. Lots of species, including some of the orchids, set their seed too late to benefit from traditional hay meadow management. And the cutting will destroy a lot of invertebrate life. However, this is the management that created our celebrated flowery meadows. This plant is yellow rattle, which is known as the meadow maker, because it's semi-parasitic on grass, and by reducing the vigor of the grass, it gives some of the other flowery flowers more opportunity to grow. I like it because of its Welsh name, Arian Apladirwr, which means the money of the scythesman, because when the yellow rattle rattles, it's time to cut the hay and the scythesman will be paid. Pensychnant has 3 meadows, and 2 of these we planted. Hitherto they were simply green fields like any other field in Wales, but we planted these with wildflowers. We didn't buy in commercial seed for a couple of reasons. One is that we wouldn't know what would be an appropriate ecological mix here. I think we would probably tend to choose the pretty things rather than the things that really belong here. And the other thing is that it's very difficult to guarantee the provenance of the seed that you're buying in. Most of the wildflower seed which you buy in packets comes from Europe, often from Eastern Europe. If you look at the A55, the hedges along the A55 come into leaf before the hedges in the farmers' fields adjacent, because the hedges along the motorway were planted with stock from Holland. So instead of buying in seed, we brought in green hay from another wildflower rich meadow. In our case, we bought it in from Treborth Botanic Garden and the police headquarters at Conwy Valley. It's quite an agricultural process, and spreading the green hay by hand over a couple of years, it has established quite a good crop of wildflowers. And at first, maybe the flowers are a bit slow to come, and maybe we've still got a long way to go before we've got the full diversity that sort of the donor meadows might have had. But even so, these fields support more invertebrates than the grazed pastures. This is one of the little micro moths. It's not rare, but let's say it's one of the slightly more fussy species of grass moths. If you walk through those fields at dusk, there are clouds of common grass moths, these little beigey colour moths that fly up as you walk through the grass. And then because of that, this is where the swallows and the martins feed. They don't feed over the green fields. Moving up the hill, Pensychnant's just over the brow of the hill there, in the second pass over the brow of the hill there to the left. This is Pensychnant Freeth, which is ecologically speaking perhaps the most important part of the farm. And this treeless landscape is prehistoric. Freeth is a word which doesn't really translate into English very well. It's sort of the upland edge of a farm. The green fields are below and the mountain or common land is above it. It's usually poorer land, often poor upland grasses, sometimes scrubby, and our Freeth is heathery. It's a site of special scientific interest, putting it amongst the prime conservation sites in Britain, and Britain's heathlands are regarded as internationally important. So in many ways, this is the jewel in Pensychnant's crown. For many years, I've harped on about Pensychnant's pied flycatchers in the woods because people like birds, but really, perhaps the Freeth is the most important habitat for wildlife conservation. And if we go up beyond Pensychnant's wall, we have what farmers would call the mountain, which is the common land, farmed in common by the community of farmers. And this is a prehistoric landscape, farmed, grazed for probably thousands of years. If it were left, if it were entirely, and the crucial thing is it is not natural. If it weren't entirely natural, it would probably be some sort of scrubby wood pasture type habitat. As we came out of the last ice age, it would be grazed by wild cattle and deer and boar. If it were left to nature now, it would all go to trees. The trees were cleared by the very first human settlers and their domestic livestock in the Neolithic time, probably 3,500 BC, so 5,500 years ago. By the Bronze Age, when the stone circle would be built, 2,500 years BC, we already had quite a well-established agriculture in Britain, and the land would have been largely denuded of trees. By the time of Christ in the year 0 and the Romans, most of the landscape would have looked very much as it looks today. Centuries or thousands of years of grazing and burning have created the heathlands which we celebrate today. And as I said, this is a very important habitat, and crucially not natural. It has been created by traditional farming. This is why I'm not wholly supportive of notions of rewilding in all of the uplands. Rewilding definitely does have its place, but it is not a panacea. This is a cultural landscape. It hasn't been woodland for 5,000 years, and the specialist fauna and flora would be lost if it is not maintained. And the flora and fauna probably is impoverished compared to what's natural, but it includes a number of very special species, especially amongst the invertebrates, and in our case at Pensychnant, especially amongst the moths, where we have 2 endemic moths, the Ashworth rustic and this one, the weaver's wave, which occur in the mountains of Snowdonia and nowhere else in the world. So to summarize, now we have a century-old system of traditional hill farming, and it's a holistic system. So we put the ewes and the ewe lambs on the mountain and on the freeth in the summer, where they're out of the way. This leaves the green fields available for the ewes with lambs to fatten up the lambs. It also means we have spare land with which we can grow our hay for winter feed. And then all of the field sheep will come down to the green fields for the winter. So I can't manage the freeth if I haven't got the green fields to put the sheep on in the winter, and I cannot grow the hay and its wildflowers if I've got the mountain and the freeth to put the sheep on in the summer. There's an elephant in the room. I don't want to sully the evening by talking about money, but there you are, I will talk about it. Like all farmers, we're not really farming livestock, we're farming the European subsidy system. In economic terms, monetarily, the sheep are nearly irrelevant. the whole system is completely perverse. So we've got about 60 ewes. We might produce 60, 70 lambs for market because we save some for breeding the next year. They'll sell 70 or 80 pounds each. The ones that I sold last November was 61 pounds each. So the total income from the lambs for the whole year is maybe £5,000–6,000 in the year. We might add to that maybe £1,000 from selling hay, but last year was a drought, so we might even end up buying in hay. So the whole farm is only making £6,000–7,000 in a year, and this isn't the profit. And this just isn't a living wage. Even quite large farms with 1,000 sheep are scarcely viable. The Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group that meet at Pensychnant says that of all of the farms in Britain, including the very big ones, only about 19% would be economically viable if it wasn't for the European subsidy. To put it in perspective, Pensychnant's farm gets about £12,000 a year from Europe. Well, it's now from Westminster. So the subsidy is double the value of the sheep. So it's totally crazy. The good news is that now we've left Europe so we can devise a better subsidy system. The bad news is that our Etonian government just hasn't got a clue. So 3 years after Brexit, there is still no plan. The European subsidy scheme has been continued by Westminster, but will end in 2023, this year. The new scheme to replace it is due to start in 2025. Yet even Rural Payment Wales, who administer the scheme, and the farming unions and the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group have not been informed of the details of the new plan. There certainly doesn't seem to be any plan how to bridge the gap between 2023 and 2025. It's a very uncertain time for farmers. The old scheme had two elements in it. The first was a single farm payment, which every farmer got, and basically it was money for nothing. So if you were rich enough to have a farm, then Europe gave you some more money. And the other element of it, which was optional, but which Pensychnant went into, was called Glastier in Wales, and that was the agri-environment scheme, which subsidised environmental works, that's what paid for our creation of our meadows, the management of the meadows, the management of fields for choughs, the management of fields for flowers. The Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, the RSPB, all of the big conservation organisations campaigned to abolish the single farm payment and to replace it with a scheme a bit more like Glastier, which in their words offers public goods for public money. Public goods could be access to the countryside, but mostly is biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, reduce pollution, and other environmental services. It's in many ways quite like Glastier. The Westminster government started quite well, if belatedly, with an Environment Act in 2021, which set out the principles of public money for public goods. Obviously, a lot of farmers weren't so happy with this. The it was immediately undermined by free trade deals with Australia, which allowed us to import food at a lower standard than we actually produce it on our own land. And then it was undermined further by Liz Truss's speech, growth, growth, growth. And there were some fears that the plan would be rather diluted. At the moment, I don't think we really know what the details will be. Agriculture is a devolved issue, so the Welsh Assembly government produced the document on the screen here, which is very much follows the Westminster line. It, again, is based on the principle of public money for public good and promises to produce food in a sustainable manner. So it's saying the right things. It sounds, I might be a bit cynical, but it sounds in many ways quite similar to a rehash of the present system. There'll be payments in return for universal actions, which is a bit like the single farm payment, and then optional actions, which is a bit more like glass tier. But some of the actions will be favourable. One thing is that every farm will be obliged to have more than 10% of its land managed to maintain and enhance semi-natural habitats and wildlife, and every farm will be obliged to have more than 10% tree cover. As always, the devil is in the detail. At the moment, there is absolutely no mention of how much money is involved in the scheme, or what the farmers will have to do to receive the grant. Farmers will inevitably want to follow the money. Even Pensychnant really will have to follow the money. And unless there is sufficient incentive, the farmers won't opt into the scheme and it will fail. This is important. 75% of Britain is farmland. And this is the end now. Lots of my friends mock me as I say that I lived somewhere between about 1850 and 1950. And partly it is true, and I'm happy there. In many ways, as we've said, the modern world is not as great as the economists like to tell us. But at Pensychnant, we're not trying to recreate the 1840s. We can recognise some good farming practices from the past, but I want to keep my quad bike. The idea is that this is not looking back. This is very much a way of looking forward to a more sustainable future. I want to demonstrate that nature and conservation can go hand in hand in the modern world. So, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much indeed. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. You can unmute yourselves and give Julian a clap if you like. Thank you very much. If you want to kind of have you stopped sharing, Julian?
Yeah, I've stopped sharing. I can see.
There you go. That's very good. That's good. Thank you very much. If anybody's got it, thanks so much, Julian. I've learned so much about Pensychnant. Even though I've been involved in a small way, I suppose, over the last few years, it's kind of I've learned a lot there too. You know what I mean? But if people have got any questions, they can.
Yes.
Go on, Jan. Yeah.
I put some long things in the chat, but it wouldn't let me do it to everyone, so I've just sent them to Julian.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay. Julian will start with that because I've not got it. Yeah.
I'll read this. I was brought up on a dairy farm in Somerset in the 1960s and 70s. My father made good living at the beginning, but had to give up in the early 80s. He hated the EU Common Agricultural Policy with a passion. I am rather afraid he would have voted for Brexit if he had still been alive. Many people thought that the public money for public good was the best thing to come out of it. But knowing how little clout farming has always had with governments in this country, especially the Conservatives, I knew they would never put aside the amount of money required to subsidise the scheme. Well, that seems probably exactly what I just said, and very true.
Also, I said, if they really don't earn you anything, why not try something else with the farm?
Well, we try many things. It's just one string to our bow. We've got the big house, haven't we? Which is more used as a centre, a community venue, and a community hub. I suppose the answer is that they earn a little bit of money. The subsidy system keeps it going. And it's achieving what by doing that, we're not getting rich, but it is achieving what we want to do. We can now manage the land. It brings in enough income that we can manage the land in a way that we want. There would be other ways of managing the land. I could have planted trees on it, or not that that would have brought any income. But I look at it much more that this is what we want to do. It's sustaining a way of life. It's sustaining tradition. It's sustaining communities, and it's sustaining these important habitats, particularly like the Freeth, which is a very ancient habitat. I can't manage the Freeth if I haven't got the green fields. Yeah, so it's all part of a whole.
It's more of a centre for study, and you had people coming there especially to see all these wonderful habitats and paying to do so. You know, like,
well, we do an element of that, don't we? I know you're doing a butterfly course soon.
you still haven't got anywhere for people to stay, and I think that might make a big difference.
Yeah, it's probably not quite big enough to have much residential. We live upstairs, as you know. Maybe in the future.
I've got thanks, John. Is that okay? I've got another couple of questions coming up here, Julian. I don't know if you can see them in the chat yourself, but it says if Julian was to dream of how a farm might look in 20 years, what would it look like? Mixed livestock, veg, or what else? That's from Nikki. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably that. I would like to hope we could go backwards, though I'm not thinking of it as backwards. Go back to a more diverse time, different types of livestock. I would like us to have sheep and some cattle. And it could have crops too, and it could have vegetables too. If we can't do that on an individual farm, at the moment it just isn't economic to have that type of diversity. I would like the landscape to become more diverse. So at the moment, the whole of North Wales, everywhere, is just sheep, isn't it? It would be better if it was a bit more mixed up. It'd be much better for wildlife. Yeah.
Okay. That okay, Nikki? Thank you. Yeah. Another one here from Danny Nissen. If cows are so beneficial, why don't you keep a small number? Don't forget, anybody who wants to ask these questions themselves, by all means, don't interrupt me and kind of pop in if you like and ask them yourselves. I'm just reading them out from the chat here, but great if you can ask them yourself when you're up for it. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
What about a few cows then?
Yeah. No, I'd love to have a few cows. It's just a question of practicalities and economics, really. I would like to we're only very small. We'd only probably have, say, 4 cows, probably store cattle. We wouldn't probably breed our own. To have just 4 cows, we would still need all the infrastructure that goes with cows, cattle structures and crushes and things like that. And also we need all the veterinary treatments and TB testing, and the bureaucracy that goes with that. So it's just a question of logistics. Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Right.
Kate gives us got a hand up.
I've just got one more question and I'll come to you, Kate. So, okay, David Hayden, what do you think of these easy care self-shedding sheep? Did you say your sheep lambs were outside unassisted? They're an alternative possibility? Yeah.
Yeah, they are they're an alternative. I don't know that they would cope with the mountains. There are lots of easy care sheep on Anglesey. They do have the benefit that their fleece falls off itself. They don't need shearing, and shearing costs more than it makes. So I understand the benefits, but the Welsh mountain sheep, they can go on the mountain, and they nearly always lamb unassisted. Pardon?
Okay.
Yeah, in last year, out of, I don't know, 90, 100 lambs born, I think I only had to pull maybe only 1 or 2. I just mostly can let them get on with it themselves. Most modern farms will lamb indoors in a big shed, and they have crossbred sheep which need more looking after, and they'll have more difficult births. Our sheep lamb outdoors, and in the night time I lead them to it because you can't walk around in the dark. It wouldn't be worth our while to bring them indoors because there's so few of them. Yeah, I could be waiting indoors all night and nothing be born, whereas the big farms have got 1,000 sheep. There'll always be something to keep someone employed, but we have to do it outdoors.
Kate, did you want to come ask a question?
Yeah, well, I was, I don't know, can people see this if I hold it up?
Yeah. 40 farms, yeah.
Yeah, it's a book written, well, really photographed and written by a farming professional photographer in Cumbria. And what you were mentioning about all the book farms being the same, in this book, it does illustrate the variety of farms there now are. I mean, James Rebank's farm is obviously one of the ones in there, and the people that are learning from him. And some of you may know about Lee Schofield, the RSPB farm, that's mentioned, and T-Bay, the farm behind that. But there are farms that are orchards and ponies and art and craft and all sorts of things. So then there are the sheep and cattle farms, but quite a variety. So interesting book.
Thank you. I will get it.
That's great. Sarah, did you want to ask a question? You put one in the chat. Do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, just sort of about I love the prehistoric farming and sort of like the impact that has obviously had over thousands of years, so do you think there's a role for farming in increasing biodiversity? Obviously there is now, but I'm thinking, has it increased over the years? I know they're kind of quite often at oppositional points because wildlife tend to but I just wonder I guess it's going forward, how can we get farming to increase biodiversity by using older methods?
Yeah,
By subsidies. That's why this new scheme is so important, but they're not going to put the money into it.
No. If we could go back to some more traditional methods, more diversity, less inputs, less chemicals, that would increase diversity. Remembering that at the moment we're at a very low point for diversity.
Yeah, really.
Yeah? nearly anything.
And going lower.
Nearly anything would make it better. There's lots of opportunities to make it better. Whether, pre-1950, it actually increased diversity, I'm not entirely sure if you're comparing it to what was entirely natural. If it had if there was no people here and it was entirely natural,
Yeah,
there may be more diversity. What we've done is skewed it. We've benefited some species
mm.
and not others.
Okay.
I mean, it sounds funny, but I keep we've just got 4 acres, but I keep a pony just for her poo, really, so I can grow my vegetables. And I don't want to use anything that's organic, but I have a living poo machine. Is that a good thing to do?
Sounds like a very good thing to do to me.
Regenerative farming has been suggested by Nikki. Does that ring any bells, Julian?
Yeah, well, in many ways, what we're advocating is regenerative farming.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I'd say sustainable farming aims to be, by definition, sustainable. You can maintain the status quo; it's not getting worse. Regenerative farming aims to make things better, and I think that's what we're trying to do. As I said, we are at a low point for biodiversity, so we can only make it better. One very key thing that's part of regenerative farming is regenerating the soils by reducing the amount of chemical inputs. As I said, a lot of soils are pretty well inorganic now. If you stop putting chemicals in them, there is nothing there. There's nothing left. It would take a while for them to get their natural nutrient cycles back again. But yeah, I think that is what we're trying to do. And I spoke to an old farmer once. He came to buy our hay, and he said, "Regenerative farming." He said, "That's what we used to call farming."
Yeah.
Mixed farming. Someone's got John. John, do you want to pop in and ask a question? Unmute.
What about using some of your land for grazing organic cattle that you don't own yourself? Is that not economically possible?
Yeah, that would be an option. Yeah, I'd like to be able to do our own, but it might be an option because it's so small scale. Not that many farmers would be that interested in doing it. There's the logistics of moving the stock in trailers from one farm to another and everything.
I mean,
also a lot of farmers do not want to put their stock on somebody else's land because of diseases and things. You have to remember, a sheep's worth about £60, a cow's worth about £1,000.
Yeah,
so they don't like.
It's just that in our fields, I mean, this is not a farm. This is just a conservation project. We have an organic farmer. She's not actually registered organic, but she is organic, and she provides simply four. It's only about 7 acres, I suppose, about four cows in the winter, or 6 perhaps. So a couple of Highland, a couple of Belted Galloway, and a couple of Welsh Black, just to graze the fields.
Yeah,
in the winter.
If there was somebody nearby wanted to do it, yes, we might do it. Yeah.
Okay. David's a question or a comment. Is it simply the case that we are David Hayden, too many sheep in Wales, or is that too simplistic?
I expect in much of Wales there is too many sheep, but there's certainly a lack of diversity. So a lot of the land is overgrazed and overused. It's not entirely simple. Some of the mountains are overgrazed. Conservationists have always complained that the mountains are overgrazed. The Common Agricultural Policy, especially through the sort of 70s and 80s, encouraged headage payments, and that encouraged overgrazing. Mountain grazing is now a dying tradition. because grazing the mountain is simply hard work.
Mm.
Gathering the sheep is really hard work. There's too much hassle from dog walkers and people chasing the sheep, and because grazing the mountain depends on a community effort. One farmer can't gather the mountain. It requires a whole community of farmers to do that. So for all of these reasons, mountain grazing is declining. Now Conwy Mountain and the mountains around us have many dozens of farms with common rights, but only ourselves and 2 others graze Conwy Mountain. It just
Yeah, but that's
worked
great.
out well.
That's what we want. That's great. That's
Well,
what
no.
happened on Halkin Mountain, where I've started a new conservation group, because naturalists have been going up there for decades looking for fritillaries, for example, because it's just the same sort of limestone grassland with bracken as on Earth Rocks, where I did a lot of habitat management work. And there just weren't any species up there. And it's just the last 5 or 6 years we've noticed all of a sudden fritillaries are popping up where they've never been recorded before. Orchids of all kinds are appearing in the grasslands, birds in the gorse. It's just fantastic what's happening. And the only reason we can think of it is that because the sheep farming has become less intense, because it's not so economic anymore.
Yeah,
so
I go along totally with that. And
it's not hurting any farmers because they can't make any money out of it anyway. And if we can just get people to agree that that's actually what we want, is a lack of sheep grazing, we could do a huge amount for the wildlife.
But if you look at photos of the Pensychnant Pass in the 1920s, it is clearly much more bare than it is now. There was a lot more use of the mountains, a lot more livestock. Now the tables have turned the other way. There's only us and 2 other farmers graze the mountain at all. Conwy Mountain is going to revert into European gorse and to woodland at the other end. Well, woodland has some wildlife value, but we are losing an internationally important heathland because of it. So there has to be some grazing, otherwise the habitat will be gone.
But we also need more trees there, because Chris Baines gave a talk to the Wildlife Trust a few years ago where he showed pictures of the Welsh mountains with sheets of water just running off it, where trees would have stopped that, and saying we need to plant the uplands again. So there's all sorts of different things we can do now if we don't need to put the sheep on there. But I appreciate your freeth is very important, but you should get some money from the schemes for protecting that.
Yeah, well, protecting it is part of the whole system, isn't it? Yeah. But and we just said, I'm afraid this government's not dishing out money very easily.
No, fair enough. Yeah. There's another question come up from Nikki. If we are needing to eat less meat, perhaps we need to find a way for farmers to be true custodians of our countryside. How do we pay them to do this? We also need far more veg growing in Wales.
Makes more sense.
Would that be relevant to Pensychnant?
Well, I can see that maybe the tide will turn and we will come to eat less meat. And then and maybe other reasons as well. Sheep won't be the way that we manage the land. And then we will have to find some other way to manage it.
Do you think the Welsh government's subsidies, which when they ever come, will enable you to kind of afford cattle more easily, or to because you did say they're a better livestock to keep for biodiversity's sake. Could you justify them? And I don't know, is that something you would like to happen with the subsidy?
I'd love to have some cattle.
Yeah,
I'd love to have some cattle. Remember, I have to take the shepherd along with my dreams.
I know that, yes,
I
yeah.
can't do it by myself.
No.
At the moment, there is very little detail in the government documents.
Yeah.
Sort of very much policy and wordy words.
Yeah.
As I read it, they seem to be quite geared towards large farms. So there will be grants towards having rare breeds.
Mhm.
So that might be one thing, but whether it would support like 1 or 2 cows as opposed to a whole herd, I'm not convinced that the present system, the coming system, will suit small farmers quite so well.
Do you think it might? Do you think they might want more public access as part of the deal? They probably will, won't they? Because public money for public goods often means public access, doesn't it? Much more, and public, which I know people can go to Pensychnant now. That's great, but that maybe, I don't know. Is that something that
Public access is one aspect of
Yeah.
the new scheme.
Yeah.
You have to remember, however, that the farming unions generally oppose most of this. So we will have to wait and see what comes out of it.
Fair enough. Yes, that's right. So it's going to be a couple of years, isn't it? Really. But then, I guess in the meantime, they're just going to keep you on what you've got, surely.
Again, we don't actually know.
No.
No one knows. It's crazy. Even the people that administer the system don't know.
But without any subsidy, which you couldn't really continue. Most farmers couldn't, could they? Like you
Most
said.
farmers, as I said, about 4/5 of Britain's farms will go bankrupt without some subsidy.
Exactly.
What would happen is the big farms would buy the small ones.
Yeah.
Which is what happened in New Zealand. And we end up with farms the size of Wales, which isn't good, probably won't be good for wildlife, and it won't be good for the traditions and the community.
Yes. Sarah's popped in again. Do you want to say this, Sarah? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just sort of, we've got a very small, sort of very, very small holding with 4 acres and a bit of woodland, bit of pasture, and because we're so small, we're so limited in what we can do. But we do use as many different types of animals. It isn't just sheep or so and when we use pigs and goats and our pony for poo, as I say, and when the animals are there for the land, and we take them off, and we either sell them or eat them. We can't move them around. We haven't got enough land to move them around. So for me, it's about using animals to manage the land, and because that clears. And the thing is, if you take animals away entirely, everything goes static and overgrown, and you get bullies coming in. The bullies, things like brambles and docks and goodness knows what, and that takes years to rebalance, just with nature. And so we do our very, very best to try and make space by moving things on and off and around. So I don't know what you think of what we do. Is that a good way of managing?
It sounds perfect, really. Yeah, on a small scale that you've got a whole diversity of animals. It sounds perfect. And that's very much how most farms would have been in the past. As I said, Pensychnant had sheep, cows, dairy cows, pigs, chickens, and crops.
We've had chickens in the past and ducks and everything. It's just kind of like we choose not because of the problems of avian flu and everything else. We've not got them at the moment.
Yeah.
I've had 8 acres small holding for 36 years, and I have the luxury of being able to do whatever I like with it because my husband's always had a good job. But I was sad to hear Julian say he has to cut the hay at a certain time, because I've got 4 small fields, and what I do is I don't graze or mow it all at the same time. I do it on a 4-year or 2 or 3 year rotation, so that I've always got 2 fields which go right through a winter without being cut or grazed at all until the next autumn. And I did that because it was, I'm particularly interested in butterflies at the beginning, and I knew that a lot of butterflies and moths hibernate in the dead stems of last year's grass. So obviously, if you keep cutting the grass, not only do you stop the later flowering things seeding, you also break the life cycles of a lot of the insects. And this has worked really well. What else was I going to say? Oh yeah, but then the other thing is I don't have any animals of my own. I just have to rely on other people paying me rent to put their horses on it. But when we first came here, local farmers put cattle to run on it, like beef cattle for a season sort of thing, and then would take them off when I told them to. And they would eat back all the little seedlings of the blackthorn coming up in the middle of the field and keep the hedges back and kept the fields open. But since we've only been using horses, because that's all the people around here want to graze, the hedges, although, you know, I always kept them uncut and very thick, but they're actually encroaching onto the field so that there's hardly any field left. And now we have to pay a contractor to come in with a dirty great digger to scrub out some of the blackthorn and things which are growing into the field. But you know, I think rotation, that's what I always try to remember to say, rotation is the key. Because the other thing that happened with not cutting the grass every year in July or August, as so many people seem to do, is that I got barn owls and kestrels and buzzards and tawny owl hunting in my fields. They come from all over and they also breed in my fields, but more than actually breed in my fields come from outside, because that's what they've lost. You can put up as many nest boxes as you like, but if you haven't got the hunting habitat of the old dead grass that falls over and creates habitat for voles and mice, that's what the raptors have to hunt. So, you know, all these things have a connection. So rotating where you cut, I think, is a good.
Thanks, Dan.
We wouldn't choose to leave our fields uncut year after year in the way that you have done. I understand the benefit. What we do instead is leave very wide margins uncut.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's difficult to get the contractors to leave a margin because they seem to take pride in getting within inches of a fence. but that's the intention. There are also some areas which are just totally rushes, which won't make good hay anyway. So all of that just gets left.
Got another question here, Julian, if that's okay, Jan. Danny, do you want to pop in there?
Thank you. I just wondered why, if so many farmers, the majority of farms are not sustainable in terms of profit without the EU payments that they used to have. Apparently, the majority of farmers voted for Brexit. If that's true, do you think they were promised something that has simply not happened? And is that why we've ended up in this chaotic system when nobody knows what's going to happen next, and a large number of farms are possibly going to be taken over or simply go out of business?
I think maybe we were all promised something by Brexit, which didn't happen, did it? The farmers get their subsidies from Brexit, so it was quite a surprise that so many did vote against it. I think mainly farmers are quite independent spirits and they didn't like all the bureaucracy and the paperwork.
Like I also said, the farmers hated the common agricultural my father, because it you know, it was just illogical, like you said at the beginning. It just, you know, we had the butter mountain and the wine lake and all that nonsense, didn't we?
It goes against everything that farmers want. It's also the present scheme, we're in Gloucester, it's very prescriptive. It tells us that we need to have 80% of our grassland more than 7 centimeters and less than 15 or something. It tells you exactly what it's got to be. Well, nature doesn't work like that. Luckily, we bend the rules a bit. So I think that's why farmers didn't like it. and I think it is true that in some way we were all promised something or had hopes of something, and didn't believe that the government would simply leave Europe without any plan at all, because they don't seem to have any plan.
Okay. I think any more questions from anybody? That's the nobody wants to talk about Brexit these days, do they much? That's the problem. I don't know why. Right, okay. I think that's, I can't see anybody else stand up. Thank you very much, Julian. I think, well, if anybody wants to go and look at Pensychnant, if they haven't been already, or they've not been for a while, or they want to go this year, when are you starting to be open, Julian? Yeah.
We've got events throughout the whole year, but the house and the grounds really open on the 1st of April.
Yeah.
Weekends through the summer. We've got tea and cake on the lawn. People come for tea and cake, really.
Yeah, as Julian mentioned, I'm doing a butterfly identification course there on March the 18th, and which was the 11th and the 18th.
You remember better than me. I can't remember.
Well, Karen just told me again the other day.
We'll have to advertise that at some point. Yeah.
Because if you're not going to be open, we need to advertise it more, don't we? Yeah.
It will be advertised. Look out for us on Facebook. Yeah, we're always on Facebook.
Mm.
Well, that's through butterfly conservation. Is that through butterfly conservation or Pensychnant? But butterfly conservation, isn't it?
No, well, I'm just doing it for Pensychnant, but I'm advertising it to the Wildlife Trust and Butterfly Conservation members and anybody who wants to learn.
Right, we'll try.
Identify and the habitats of all our local butterflies.
Okay. Well, okay, thank you, Julian. That's really good. I think everyone's learned a lot. There's a lot of contributions from different people too, which is really good. I'll sort this video out and kind of put the recording on and inform everybody, send everybody an email. And if there's anything else, Julian, that you want to add to it, add to any information, I can put that in the email I send as well. If we're going to say goodbye to you now, Julian, but before we do, I don't think anybody else is going to ask any questions. If everybody wants to kind of unmute themselves and show themselves, we can give Julian a bit of a round of applause, really, for his talk tonight. So, okay, before we give him a big send off. Please unmute yourself if you're still there. Unmute yourself so we can. And even just show yourself briefly. You don't mind doing that? You didn't expect that, I don't think, did you? No, you don't normally get that from Zoom, David, I suppose, but if it's a live talk, you will get it, obviously. We always like to give you a round of applause. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. All right, thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.